It's late at night. You're lying in your bed, holding your phone up beside you, the light of its screen blinding out the relative darkness of the room, and for a moment it feels like there's nothing but you and the screen. You find yourself on Wikipedia, looking up something, but before you can even get to the information you are after, you find a word or name that spikes your interest, and so naturally you click on that link, and before you know it you find yourself doing the same process over and over, sinking deeper into the item or person or old TV show, and then suddenly it's 6:30 in the morning, and the light from the early morning sun has started to cast shadows and illuminate the room. And you look back at your phone, and you find yourself looking at a list of Bulgarian mid-sedan cars of the 1970s? That's morbid curiosity. How far have you ever been from the rest of the world? Maybe you've gone into the Scottish Highlands, where you are miles from the nearest community of people. Maybe you've explored the world, been in the wilds of Montana, where there are tens of miles between you and the nearest other human being. Now imagine being on an island, almost 700 kilometers from the nearest other group of human beings. Imagine being in that situation with a group of less than 50 people for more than 200 years. What do you think that does to a community? What do you think that does to a society? Well, Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific has acted as a test of that for the last 200 years. Episode 4, Pitcairn Island. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Morbid Curiosity with me, your host, Adam Self. This week, we'll be looking at the remote paradise island of Pitcairn and its odd history from being the refuge of mutineers to a scandal that rocked the entire island and exposed its dark secrets to the world. So what is, or more accurately, where is Pitcairn Island? Well, it's in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. It sits about 680 kilometers from French Polynesia on one side and 1,900 kilometers from Easter Island on the other. It's incredibly remote. Pitcairn Island is actually one of 4 islands that make up the Pitcairn Island group, with the others Henderson Island, Dulce Island and Oeno Islands being basically uninhabited due to there being no fresh water or any kind of livable resources on the islands. The islands are part of the British Overseas Territory and are simply called Pitcairn Island. The Pitcairn Islands were formed by a volcanic formation, the same formation that created the French Polynesian Islands almost 700 kilometers away. They were first inhabited by Polynesians sometime before the 15th century. When they were first discovered by Europeans, the Portuguese sailor Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz in 1606, he named them the Incarnation and St. John the Baptist. Following this, the next sighting was in 1767 by the British sloop HMS Swallow, and Pitcairn Island was named after 15-year-old Robert Pitcairn, a midshipman who was the first to spot the island. The captain of the voyage, Philip Carteret, mislabeled the position of the island, placing it over 330 kilometers away from its actual position, which caused the island to become very difficult to find in the years following. Other than these brief visits, however, the island would remain uninhabited for some time.
I dreamed a dream the other night. Lowlands, lowlands away,
In 1790, the crew of the HMS Bounty mutinied against their captain, a fellow by the name of Captain William Bligh. Led by acting officer Fletcher Christian, the crew took control of the ship and cast Captain Bligh and 18 loyalists adrift in a small boat. 25 men remained on the Bounty, and they initially attempted to settle on an island called Tupai, but the hostile reception from the natives caused them to reconsider this plan. They returned to the ship's last port of call before the mutiny, Tahiti, where the crew deceived the locals into providing them with goods and livestock and men and women for a potential settlement that they claimed to be building. They then returned to Tubi, and for the next 2 months they attempted to settle the small coral reef island, but the local inhabitants of the island remained very hostile to them, ending in a battle where 66 islanders were killed. Having no choice but to flee the island, the crew split in opinion, and after a vote, 16 men wished to return to Tahiti, and after dropping them off, the 9 remaining crew on the Bounty left, kidnapping more locals, mainly women, as they did so. They sailed west in search of a safe haven, and Christie and Fletcher had heard of Pitcairn Island's discovery. After months of searching, partly due to the mislocating of the island by previous visitors on maps, they located Pitcairn Island in 1790, and given how difficult the island had been for them to locate themselves, they saw it as a prime location to settle down and escape.
I dreamed my love came in my sleep. Lowlands, lowlands away, Imogen. Her cheeks were wet, her eyes did weep. Lowlands away. She came to me at my bedside.
Upon arrival on the island, the mutineers and their captives set about unloading the ship and stripping it of anything of use. Once it had been gutted, they set ablaze to the ship in the bay, which now still holds its name, and where the wreck of the Bounty still remains to this day. The motives for destroying the ship had never been conclusively proved, be it a precaution against discovery or an unauthorized act by a crewman. But this action removed the mutineers' only means of escape from the island, meaning for its new residents it was now a permanent home. Life on the island was pretty adequate for the mutineers, with supplies of water, food and fertile soil to plant crops in. The mutineers started to settle down with the female Polynesians that they had abducted, and several children were born. But the idyllic escape the sailors had hoped for would not last long. Soon tensions grew between the sailors and the people that they had forced into their way of life, with the Tahitians being treated as property and the women passed around between the men. In 1793, things came to a head when a few of the mutineers, including the leader of the original mutiny, Fletcher Christian, were murdered by the captives. In the following year, all 6 of the men that had been taken from Tahiti had been killed, leaving only the women and children left from the native survivors. Although seemingly most, if not all of these deaths came from one another or widows of the murdered soldiers that they had attacked. There was now only 4 of the mutineers left: McCoy, Quintal, Young and Adams. The latter 2 attempted to create a peace on the island. However, McCoy and Quintal continued to get drunk on booze distilled from the island's fruits, and McCoy ended up committing suicide in 1798, and the following year, after threats from Quintal, the remaining 2 sailors, Adams and Young, murdered him to ensure a tentative peace on the island. Only 1 year later, in 1800, Young died from asthma, and John Adams became the last survivor of the Bounty. He led a community of 9 women and 19 children. This was the way of life in 1808, when an American sealing ship by the name of Topaz by chance came across the island. Gifts were given to the captain of the Topaz, Mayhew Folger, of the Bounty's compass and chronometer. Word did not reach Britain until 1810, but due to a small, tiny little thing called the Napoleonic War, nothing was really done about the Bounty's location. In 1814, however, 2 warships flying the British flag appeared in Bounty Bay, the HMS Britain and the HMS Tagus. They were greeted on the island by Thursday October Christian, the son of Fletcher Christian, and George Young, Edward Young's son. The captains of the ships were impressed by the honest features of his English face. They met the community on the island, which was almost 46 people at this point, who were still being led by John Adams. Given the community's seemingly flourishing nature, the captains reported back to the Admiralty, and they decided that no further action would be taken against Adams or the community. The only survivor of the Bounty effectively receiving a pardon for his crimes. Adams would lead the community until his death in 1829. He would often tell stories to any ships that stopped at the islands, and he was held up on the island as a founder and leader of the community. In 1831, the islanders requested transport to Tahiti, fearing overcrowding and lack of resources given the increasing size of the community. The British government transported them to Tahiti, but soon the Pitcairners found the place to be full of immorality and sin, and they struggled to adapt to the new social culture. Several of the islanders died of sickness, including Thursday October Christian, the son of the original mutineer. Given the difficulties, the islanders returned to Pitcairn Island after only 6 months in Tahiti. The following year, in 1832, a visitor would come to the island. Joshua Hill claimed to be an agent of the British Empire and was quickly elected as the new leader on the island in the power vacuum that remained after John Adams's recent death. Calling himself President of the Commonwealth of Pitcairn, he demanded alcohol be banned and ordered strict punishments for the slightest of crimes. His little petty kingdom lasted until 1838, when a visiting British ship caught him and subsequently helped the islanders create Pitcairn's first law code and systems, part of which was a chief magistrate role to lead the island, which would be voted in on a yearly basis. One of the laws on the code was actually for the ability for women to vote, which at the time in 1838 had only been done by one other country in the world, which was Corsica in 1755. Life under the new laws and practices proved productive for the island, and by the middle of the 1850s, overpopulation was once again becoming an issue for the islanders. They wrote to Queen Victoria herself for help, and she offered them a home on Norfolk Island, a little remote rock of an island halfway between New Zealand and the isolated New Caledonia Islands. In 1856, all 163 residents of Pitcairn Island boarded the ship Mauritius and spent 5 weeks travelling to their new home. Whilst the island was empty during this time, in 1858, survivors of a shipwreck spent several months on Pitcairn until they were rescued by the USS Vandalia. During their time on the island, the sailors had taken apart houses for supplies, and they had even vandalised the grave of John Adams. France had also made an attempt to claim the island, not realising that it had recently been inhabited and claimed by the British Empire. This attempt did not last long, however. Meanwhile, on Norfolk Island, some of the settlers were less than happy with the former prison island that they had been gifted, and in 1859, 16 returned to Pitcairn, and they were not the only ones, with 27 others following in 1864. They weren't the only people to settle back on Pitcairn Island in this time, however, as an American family called Warren settled on the island. In 1886, a Seventh-day Adventist by the name of John Tay visited the island and converted most of the islanders from their original Church of England beliefs to Seventh-day Adventism. He visited again in 1890, and he performed baptisms with an ordained minister of the church. During this time in the late 19th century, many ships visited Pitcairn Island, and by most accounts found a community that was happy and in good health. Ships would give regular supplies or gifts to the islanders, allowing them to increase the size and quality of the community on the island. During this time, some of the magistrates included Thursday October Christian II, who was the grandson of the original mutineer Fletcher, and James Russell McCoy. Russell McCoy had been educated in England as a child and helped work with the islanders to get Britain to officially annex the islands in 1887. By 1937, the island had a population of 233 people, which was which is a peak that it is yet to return to. Emigration became more of a draw as people left for places like Australia and New Zealand, and in 1938 the island was formed into a single administrative unit. Given the Pacific's volatile state in the 1930s and 40s, trade with passing ships declined, and residents were forced to sell relics from the Bounty, as well as cultural items from the original Polynesian settlers. In 1941, British colonial administrator Henry Evans Maude and his wife were sent to the island to help run the community, and establish a post office with unique collectible stamps as a way of collecting funds for the island. For a lot of the 20th century, the island's magistrate role seemed to have been either the Christian or the Young families, descendants from the original settlers on the Bounty, but as technology increased, so did contact with the outside world, and in the 1970s the island's new governors were actually the British High Commissioners in New Zealand, and in 1999, just before the millennium, the role of Chief Magistrate was retired, with a new role of Mayor, which was treated as more of an honorary role. But to the outside world, whose exposure of Pitcairn Island increased over the 20th century, questions were starting to be raised about the culture and habits of some of the island's residents. Soon, Pitcairn Island's secrets would be exposed to the world. In 1999, a police officer on temporary assignment began to hear allegations of sexual abuse on the children on the island, culminating in a 15-year-old girl pressing for a rape charge. This caused criminal proceedings to begin, which were codenamed Operation Unique. Police officers from the UK, Australia and New Zealand travelled to the island to interview every woman that had lived there or had lived there in the last 20 years, as well as every single one of the accused men. These interviews confirmed horrid tales of sexual assault upon children as young as 3. In 2004, a trial against 7 men living on the island and 6 who had emigrated away from the island was held. Given the island's small population, the 7 men accounted for a third of the male population of the island. After a conclusive trial, almost all of the men were found guilty of their crimes. Given the men's jobs as maintainers of the island's infrastructure of power and utilities, sending them to a prison in New Zealand or Australia or the UK would have crippled the island's viability as a community. So, the British government set up a small prison facility on the island in a location called Bob's Valley. The men helped in the construction of their own prison, and they were permitted to leave the prison during the day if their job on the island required it. These men started serving their sentences in 2006, and by 2010, all of them had completed their sentence or had been granted home release status. Sadly, however, in 2010, the current mayor of the island, Mike Warren, was charged with 25 counts of illegal pornography on his computer. The trial and prosecution hit the island's already meagre tourism industry, and large incentives for people to move to the island or emigrate to Pitcairn Island were not taken up. As of the last census count, the island's population was 47, with a large majority of those being elderly and with a certain percentage of those off the island for work or personal reasons. A survey projects that at its current population decline, there will only be 3 people left of working age by 2045 on the island. Those who have left the island who were surveyed have little desire to return. In 2014, a report stated that there are limited government jobs, a lack of private sector employment, and better competition for the tourism dollar. At a certain point, outside help from the British government will be required to either develop the island's population and infrastructure or evacuate the remaining settlers. it becomes more and more apparent that Pitcairn Island's sustainability and future seems numbered. So that was the story of Pitcairn Island, a place born from criminality that became a sort of remote paradise, and then something dark hidden at its core, and a very uncertain future. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story with me. I've been your host, Adam Self, and until next time, goodbye world. This has been Morbid Curiosity, a Crazy Eyes Dave production. Oh my god. You had to do a story about historic sex crimes, didn't you? Couldn't just do a normal one. Had to be about monsters. What is wrong with you?